All right. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so my name is Hector. Okay. So my thesis actually is titled "A Pedagogical Approach to Learner-Centered Design for Audio Mixing." There's actually a lot of different components in my research, so it gets pretty broad, but they all kind of point and lead back to the same direction. So I did have a little bit of a challenge in terms of titling it because, like, so many keywords to sort of include over there. So during my research, during my presentation itself, I will try to categorize things as much as possible to help you better understand what all the different facets. And there are also a couple of accidental discoveries in terms of my research. So it might seem like it's diverging, but right at the very end, I'll try to pull everything back in again. So before I begin itself, let me just allow me to do a brief introduction about my background. So I'm primarily, I would describe a computer musician, audio engineer, music technologist. So I kind of deal with that domain. So as an educator, I teach things like music production and audio production. Sounds similar, but slightly different, right? So audio production, it's a bit more technical, while music production gets a little bit more creative aspect of it. Even though they might be dealing with a similar domain of equipment, a similar domain of technologies itself, there are slight differences. So in my research, I actually cover both aspects of it because that's what I teach. I teach audio engineers or budding audio engineers. I also teach musicians. So I kind of try to encompass both related domains within my research. So let me just go on. Okay, so my research area itself, um, broadly encompass manipulation of user interface and user experience design of digital audio workstation or DAWs or DAWs. So these two pictures you see are kind of user interfaces that you see in the world of music technology. All right, they are complex. There are lots of knobs. There are lots of flashing lights, moving things, things that gets pretty complex and complicated. And you'll see a lot of what's skeuomorphic design, which means that emulation of real world interfaces. So things like a knob, even though it's actually flat and you actually use a mouse and you click and you drag, instead of actually being able to physically grab and twist. So the interaction might not actually be the same, but we kind of keep the same visual representation. So, existing research around this area itself primarily focuses on finding new ways to approach audio mixing altogether, such as, oh, let's drop the whole DAW thing of like, oh, having to pan things, having a volume fader. Let's try to grab this sound and put it on the left side or right side of a stage itself. So, there's a lot of research going in that direction, but my research primarily focus in a slightly different way. My research tries to address points from the perspective of the learner, because that research itself, existing research talks about things like professionals, how professionals can work, but they don't really go down to the fundamental things of supporting what an educator can do in terms of helping a learner learn such a complex and technically challenging craft, especially for musicians who might be more artistic and less technically inclined. All right, it proves to be a more significant challenge as compared to an audio engineering student who has already been familiar with a more technical aspect of things. All right. So the first thing in part of my research area that I kind of dive into is the concept of audio mixing and listening in that process of audio mixing. So firstly, for people who are not familiar, audio mixing is a process where we take multiple audio tracks that were recorded in a studio or maybe in a live environment. We kind of balance them, changing levels, tweaking them a little bit, and then finally outputting most commonly into a stereo audio format, which can allow a listener to play back onto their headphones, onto the speakers itself. Now, the final output of the audio mixing process is known as an audio mix. It does go by a whole bunch of different terms, but I'm going to use the term audio mix in this case. And the source material will be known as the multi-track recording. Now, listening itself is a very integral part of audio mixing because the material is sound. It's 100% auditory, right? You can't see the sound, even though we can see whatever's happening in the DAW. But actually, what you see in the DAW doesn't contribute to the final listening experience of the listener. So I'm focusing on the listening. Now, it's a pretty illogical kind of logical flow. If you can't hear something, it's kind of hard for you to make a conscious decision of whether passing judgment or perceiving whatever it is. So the listening skill is a very important part of audio mixing. All right, it's if you can't hear something, it's a bit hard to kind of mix something itself. So I dive into the concept of listening itself. And previously, this research I've been going on for a year. So the previous semester, I kind of did talk about it, and I focused on the concept of critical listening. Now, critical listening is something that's a little bit more audio engineering related, where critical listening is a point where the listener itself is concerned about the quality of the sound, all right, in a more technical aspect of things. So you're listening critically means you're listening to the quality of the sound and passing judgment over there. Now, there's another form of listening, all right, which Elliot describes as music listening. So music listening itself kind of leans back more to a musician point of view itself, all right? And Elliot describes his quotes over there: for all acts of musical performing always involve music listening. And music listening is also a matter of procedural knowledge, and listening is a matter of minding. So he puts this point from a musician point of view, which, because we're mixing music, we're not mixing just noise, all right, there is a need, a consideration of a similar thing to what a performer does. Should I go louder at this point? Should I play louder? Should I pull it back? Those are the same things that the audio engineer or the person mixing can actually do. I can make it louder, I can make it softer, I can change the timbre of the sound as well. So I am drawing a parallel that the person who is mixing the audio is in a way a performer as well. All right, albeit not necessarily live, but in a live concert environment, it could be a live performance. Now, the next concept over there is learner-centered design. Now, learner-centered design itself is actually a design, actually a perspective taken from the domain of design. All right, so learner-centered design, the design perspective that takes into consideration of the learner, all right, who might not have the same level of expertise and knowledge as another person in the same domain, especially someone who is an expert. So you're talking about addressing the needs of a learner. Now, there are actually parallels itself, so for designers itself, you'll probably be familiar with by a person called Don Norman. All right, so there are other perspectives such as user-centered design and human-centered design itself. So learner-centered design was actually first written in 1994 by Elliot Soloway, Kenneth Hay, and Mark Gusdal, where they actually ported it and adapted it from user-centered design. So if you take a look at the diagram on the right over there, okay, the diagram is actually the same for user-centered design, but at the center of that, instead of learner's needs, it is the user. So you are designing everything around the user, thus user-centered design. So the learner-centered design means you swap out the learner and you put in the learner's needs, and you are now designing the task, the interface, and the tools all around the learner's needs. So this is what Soloway et al. Actually describes as the tilt model, where the tools interface, learners' needs, and tasks, learner-centered design model. And actually in this model, they actually scaffold it, they suggest scaffolding strategies, which are known as modes of expression, coaching, modeling, and adaptable, in terms of how can we design such a way that the tasks address the learner's needs, the interfaces addresses the learner's needs, the tools addresses the learner's needs. So the next thing that I kind of pull in is cognitive load theory. So because we need to address the learner's needs, and I don't want to take it away where, as an educator, I know best. It's kind of like assumption. So I don't want to do that, and I'm trying to take into account from what cognitive science can actually provide us in terms of understanding how to best help someone to learn. So the cognitive sciences has tons and tons of research in there already, so I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. I'm actually going to try to take more established research methods or knowledge over there and then try to inform my research over there. So one of the domains over there under cognitive sciences is something called cognitive load theory, or CLT. So the knowledge from CLT research actually helps us to understand in terms of cognitive processing or capacity of the learner itself, all right? And there are actually a whole bunch of different things in there, but there are a couple of key assumptions over there. The key assumptions over there is there's a finite working memory, which is a temporary memory that we can kind of work with itself, all right? And then there are 3 different cognitive loads that we can break it down into: intrinsic cognitive load, extraneous cognitive load, and germane cognitive load. Now, due to time constraints itself, I can't go really in depth, but I'll highlight a couple of things. So intrinsic cognitive load got to do with the difficulty of the task. So cognitive load imposed by the difficulty of the task itself. Extraneous cognitive load is talking about anything that's not necessarily related to the task, which could be, how difficult the instructions were given, how complicated the instructions were given. So things related to instructional design. So extraneous cognitive load, we can manipulate. Intrinsic cognitive load, we generally can't manipulate through instructional design. Germane cognitive load is actually something that we want to allow, because germane cognitive load is the cognitive load that actually promotes learning. And it's actually kind of something that falls as something that's kind of like a default thing. So if there's no working memory capacity remaining to allow the learner to process that germane cognitive load, learning actually doesn't occur. So that's why I want to take the understanding of cognitive sciences itself to kind of inform what I would then dub as the learner's needs in that way itself. So we can see from this diagram itself, relational complexity, the expertise is connected to the intrinsic cognitive load. Instructional design affects the extraneous and the germane cognitive load, and they're all linked to the learning outcomes. So I'll tie things in a little bit more later on. Now, the next type of load that comes in a similar domain is something called perceptual load theory. Perceptual load theory got to do with us actually perceiving something, okay, in terms of the visual and the auditory kind of information that we perceive itself. Okay, so just because you can see something doesn't necessarily mean that we are perceiving and we are and our cognitive processes are actually processing it. It's kind of like, some of you might be actually watching the presentation and you're kind of like tired and you're just zoning out. Your eyes can see it, but you might not process it. So perceptual load theory got to do with attention theory, how your ability to pay attention to something. All right. So the most common ones will be eyes and our ears itself, and there are a couple of interesting things over here. So there's something called the Cola Vita visual dominance effect, which means actually for adults, we are actually visual dominant. Okay, we will see something. If we see something and we hear something, our visual sense will actually dominate our auditory sense. Okay, and there's a whole bunch of other things that kind of falls into the side effect. Once again, all these are all assumptions, but they are well-established assumptions in these domains itself. All right, and to progress itself, we kind of have to assume certain things are true, thus leading to certain things. Therefore, there are a couple of things that I'll bring up during my limitations portion of things as well. All right. So once again, perceptual load theory does connect to the cognitive load theory in terms of working memory as well. So coming back to visual nature of the DAWs itself. So the high complexity of this visual nature of all these DAWs, I am positing these kind of assumptions first. That is causing a high perceptual load, because there's so many things for you to see and no things are flashing at you. It's kind of like trying to concentrate on one thing on a very crowded environment itself. So it is going to create a very high visual perceptual load. But pulling back into the concept of listening, the visual perception should actually be ignored. So now I'm trying to see is how can I help the learner to ignore all this visual perception to focus on the auditory sense, because they don't necessarily have the skill set and expertise to listen well yet. So all these other things are just going to act as distractors. All right. So I'm trying to remove these distractors now. So I actually come across, and this is a model that I actually drew up just to better understand what happens when we have an auditory-centric versus domain, a kind of stimulus that actually has both auditory and visual cognition. So if you take a look at the diagram that's on the right, okay, this is the typical kind of situation. You have both auditory and visual stimulus. So both of these things affect your decision-making process, okay, and then affects your decision made will result in a new form of interaction and then generate new stimulus again. Assuming the Cola Vita visual dominance effect, the visual cognition will actually overpower the auditory cognition. So what I am trying to propose is to actually eliminate the visual elements itself, the visual cognition, by creating an auditory-centric environment so that your decision-making process is affected now by the auditory situation now, which is actually something that a lot of musicians actually do practice already. When we're playing on our instruments, it's a very common thing for us to close our eyes, and there's a very strong thematic element of closing eyes, right? But musicians are always practicing it. But it's a very big challenge, right? To close your eyes and use the computer, right? You can't see. So we kind of need to figure out a new way of actually doing things. How can you see something but not see something? All right. So my idea is to first go approach it by designing what I would define as an auditory-centric control. Okay, and the conventional design over there is actually based off a rotary knob, and then I'm actually having a proposed design over there. And this animation kind of shows, so I can actually turn the knob over there, and the indicator is actually giving me information of what is the current value, current position of this knob. How do I make you not see it? I basically remove the indicator. Now there is no way for you perceiving what the current value is, reducing the information over there, but you can still interact with it in exactly the same manner. You still click and you move your mouse up and you move your mouse down. You just don't get the visual information back. So what do you have to do? You just have to listen. So this is kind of like a hypothesis, like, will this work and stuff like that. So I kind of developed an entire interface around it, which allows a basic function of the audio mixing process, which encompasses of only two basic functions, which is volume changes with a volume knob and a pan control. So a pan control actually allows us to place the sound to the left or to the right speaker or anywhere in between. So these are only two things. There are a bunch of other things in audio mixing that we can do in terms of EQs, adding reverb effects and stuff like that. But I'm simplifying this down so that during my experimentation process with my participants, the barriers of entry is going to be lower and I can actually test with novices instead of just working with experts. All right, so study number one, I actually did two separate studies. So the first study itself actually focuses on understanding what effect does the user interface have on the audio mixing process, just to test that this whole thing works first, before we try to go a bit further over there. All right, so my experiment design actually involved both novices and experts. I had a pretty small sample size of 8 participants first, just because I was using a grounded theory approach, or rather a constructivist grounded theory approach by shamans, okay, which means that I would need to constantly compare all the findings itself. So by having a smaller sample size itself, it allows me to dive deeper. And the preliminary process itself required me to sort of discover all these additional themes. Therefore, I adopted the grounded theory approach before, so that I can discover what themes I need to look out for in my primary research. Now, in my overall process, I actually did use a quantitative method as well. So I actually did a pragmatic mixed methods approach. But I'll talk a little bit about what the quantitative methods turn out later on during the findings. It mainly involved recording the interaction timings, how long did it take to click on something and stuff like this. All right. So the design itself, experiment itself was pretty simple. I basically actually gave the interface. So if you look over here, I had one with indicators, one without indicators. I actually just got the participants to try doing one time with the indicators and one time without the indicators. Now, because this is a brand new interface for them, I actually did a control pass with them. So they actually did a total of 3 sessions. The first time was with the indicators, just to familiarize them. Second time with the indicators, this was the actual test. And the third time without the indicators, and kind of just collected their findings. I did interviews after each pass itself to ask them, all right, so what were you thinking of? What were you feeling of? And it was a semi-structured interview so that they can talk about anything and everything. And I try to find out as much as I can. So some of the findings that arise was that participants did agree that there was an emphasis on their auditory skills because there was no visual feedback for them to kind of look at anymore. All right. This visual feedback itself was disappeared, so that the only thing I can do is listen. All right. There was also a change in the the behavior of the participants. There was less what I call visual mixing, which means that some of them were looking at the dials and turning the dials to a very specific point visually. Some of them were actually turning the dials when the thing has already stopped playing it. The whole track stopped and they were still turning and then they're lining things up itself. So it means that there was influence of the visuals in that case over here. All right. So there was these signs of visual influence in the audio mixing decision. I want to just point out one interesting one for me over here. Actually, is this. So this actually shows the pan and the volume controls. Okay. If the pan knob is the one at the top, so if the line is at the top, it means that it's right in the center. If it's pan to the left or pan to the right, then it will sonically shift to the left or right speaker. So you can see actually I took 2 participants' data and I overlapped over them with them. So participant 2 and participant 3, I took actually the first and the third test, okay, in this case, and you can see, right, on participant 2, right, what they do is, it's a very common thing. When you got 2 electric guitars, you actually pan one to the left, one to the right, symmetry. But you can see in test number 1 where they can see the blue lines are visually symmetrical, But the red color lines, which in test 3, where it's removed, they are no longer visually symmetrical, but they perceive it to be auditorily symmetrical, which means that the visual component, once taken away, actually changes the way they approach things, and what they thought sound good actually doesn't necessarily need to be visually symmetrical. So there are a couple of things that I want to just point out over here in terms of summarizing some of the discussion in this case itself. So the auditory-centric interface does change the audio mixing process. There's a bunch of different things itself. I've written some in my paper. I've written some in my last semester's paper as well. But the big focus will be on the second study. So I'm summarizing it that yes, there is a change in the audio mixing process, but there's one thing that we need to know is how can we better understand it and apply it to practice in terms of the pedagogy for the learner itself. So that's the thing that I do, because understand it affects experts in a certain way, affects novices in a certain way. Now, how can we apply that to teaching? So I actually adapted my interface a little bit and sort of went back to not really totally a drawing board, but I sketched out a little bit more, trying to find new kind of auditory-centric controls, okay, which could sort of, take this a step further. Okay, trying to make it aesthetically pleasing and so forth. All right, so the revised interface actually kind of looks like that. Okay, because someone I actually spoke to gave me a feedback, say, oh, it kind of looks ugly. If it's ugly, I don't want to use it. So I tried to make it a little bit nicer looking, taking away one component, visual, aesthetic appeal itself. All right, so you see that it takes a slight skeuomorphic design, which looks a bit more like a rotary control. Okay, but once I take away that white color indicator, you'll see that you can't really tell, okay, where the position anymore. But the trim on the side actually does give you an indication when it's moving that it is turning. So there are some indicators to it, but not enough to actually distract you from it. Okay, because some of the participants were wondering, the thing, is it broken? Are you trying to bluff me that it's actually not working and stuff like that? So that rotary control, it does appear there now. Okay, so study number 2 focuses on 2 points over here. How does the UI affect the listening and the audio mixing experience? So I know the effects, now I understand how does it affect. And then the second thing I was trying to find is how can we use this information to develop a pedagogy around it. So the idea of it is that in study number 2 itself, I actually took a small subset, and this time I only used 3 novices in my study. Okay, they were basically asked to self-conduct the study sessions on their own, because one of the things that I discovered was the duration of the experience actually does make a difference. Because in a previous study, they kind of felt like there was a bit of a challenge that, oh, I only got 5 minutes, because they only had 5 minutes to interface on each pass. So because you only got 5 minutes, I can't really solve some of the problems myself. So that was one of the feedback that was given to me. So this time I gave the whole thing to them and I just said, all right, take this, go and play around with it. I'm going to kind of structure your practice sessions, actually primarily for my research purposes, but later on it somehow turned into a pedagogy. So I told them that, all right, all of you, you have this interface itself. I need you to sort of use the interface for at least 20 minutes, so that there's a bit of time for you to develop, but you can use longer if you want to. So if you want to use longer, use it, but no shorter than 20 minutes. All right. So the practice session 1, after practice session number 1, they did a reflection on practice session 1, which allows me to collect the data. Then they did practice session 2, and then they reflected on it, which allows me to collect the data. And then practice session 3, and then they reflect and it allows me to collect the data itself. And they returned to the data to me all the way, and I did not intervene during the 3 sessions at all. It was totally all on them. There was one criteria itself, is that during the use of the revised interface itself, all right, session number 1, they cannot show the indicators at all. It has to be hidden totally. Now in session number 2, they can choose whenever they would like to show the indicators, but once they've shown it, they must reset the thing back to 0 again. So they have to start from the beginning again. And the third time, they actually show the indicators and then they can just hide it and continue again. So I wanted to see how would things change when I sort of change the control parameters. Now, one key distinction which will tie into my research later on is this. I mentioned to them that you can do that, you don't have to do that. So I'm giving them the autonomy to do something, but I'm not saying that you must do something. All right, in terms of showing the indicators itself. So some of my findings are that the visual information in DW does affect the user experience for them. They all mentioned that I have to, if I see something, I will feel that it tells me some truth. So one example that one of my participants said in her previous experience said that, yeah, there were a couple of times that I loaded the plugin, I turned, and I thought that it changed something and it sounded better. Actually, I never turned the thing on at all. So, which means that the visual actually create a false perception of sound. All right, they weren't actually paying attention to the auditory centricity of it. So they did describe their experience as more auditory centric because they said the term that they used was forced to listen. So it wasn't a choice; they were ultimately forced by the circumstances to have to listen itself. All right, and the effect of the visual indicators on the audio mixing process was very interesting because I've given them the ability to sort of, choose whether they want to show or not. Some of them started making very conscious decision of, do I want to show it? Do I want to hide it? What can I do with it? All right, and I'll talk a little bit more about this thing in terms of the power that actually they have to do that. The participants also adapted to the interface. All right, some of them came up with new ways of listening and say, oh, okay, I can't mute things anymore. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull all the volume down and bring them up one by one. They adapted to that process itself because they can't see whether something is up or not. They just pull everything down. So they started adapting to it, which means that they actually do have the ability to figure out new ways of doing things when they are sort of given, a kind of situation or kind of restrictions itself. It's not exactly it's related, but I don't think it's totally forced creativity, which is a totally different thing, which is a totally big thing altogether. And my research doesn't go into that, but that could be something to explore in the future. But one key thing over there was that they did have some challenges in remembering the sounds. Okay, because there was no level meters telling them what was playing or not. They had to remember it. There were some challenges in that. Which they did bring up. They did figure out ways of trying to adapting to figure out to it. But I want to point out a couple of things in terms that I think this is one of those things that prove a little bit too difficult for them. So to come to my discussion itself. So using an auditory centric design. So I think that it's a very interesting things in terms of using auditory centric design because it allows them to focus on listening experience. Okay, there's actually something called in the perceptual load theory itself, something called inattentional deafness, okay, which means that because you don't pay attention to something, you actually turn deaf. All right, it's like, someone talking to you, you are distracted, you actually don't pay attention to them, you are inattentionally deaf. Okay, so all these kind of things actually shows that yes, auditory centric design does assist the learner to focus on their listening and develop that process itself. And by reducing the perceptual and extraneous cognitive load itself, we are actually freeing up the working memory to allocate it to germane cognitive load, which enhances learning, development of schema. So this is where I'm trying to shift that load now, reducing all the load that is not necessary and shifting it over there. But one other thing is also interesting is that it seemed that the participants actually had an evolution in terms of relationship between the gestural input, so the input that they're actually doing, and the auditory perception right now. Because there were a couple of things that they did quite interestingly. In the first study itself, a lot of them were pointing out this track, which was actually the keyboard track. They say, I can't hear it. Is it broken? Is it not working? But somehow the moment the control indicators was taken out, they could all hear it already. Now, the interesting thing was actually that track was slightly softer and the track didn't play all the time. It went in and out. But somehow once I take that out, they kind of changed it. And then by changing that relationship because previously when you click and you create an input, you see something turn. Then you have to process what you hear separately. Now, when you click and you drag something, the sound is straight away, the kind of feedback that you get already. So I am actually shortening that kind of like that sonic interaction and making it more direct. Okay, which is very similar to you grabbing a knob, closing your eyes and turning it. You're not actually seeing something. There's no intermediate step to it. Now, the next thing I want to try address is also about addressing the task of instructional design. A side effect with my research is that because I've actually simplified this to only volume and pan changes itself, the participants actually said that I actually know what to do now. Because I only can do these two things, I know what I need to do. So it seems that actually this process actually scaffolded their learning experience by saying that there are all these other things that you can't do because you literally cannot do it. Okay, so you only going to focus on these two things. And what they did was they felt that they developed their skills in terms of using volume and pan controls to actually develop the mix. They wish they had all these other things, but because they can't, they had to adapt. So we are creating a learning environment and saying that hey, I'm shining the spotlight on these things right now. And by simplifying the task for the learner into these two aspects itself, all right, we are actually adopting a process of scaffolding, all right? And the other thing that I find that I kind of really like itself is that we are integrating the development of learning skills directly with the activity of audio mixing. I don't have to conduct a separate class on listening, which is pretty common in music education itself. You have an oral and then a theory lesson. All right, you separate out the skills itself, but now by integrating the skills into practical application, you are showing the students itself that, hey, this is how you apply this. I don't have to teach you how to apply your knowledge from another class anymore. Now, the other thing is, this is the accidental finding itself. So somehow the 3 sessions turned out to be some form of experiential learning cycle for them. All right, so I'm actually using Cope's experiential learning cycle over here, which has active experimentation, concrete experience, reflective observation, and then abstract conceptualization. So what the participants actually did was, instead of me giving instruction of this is how you mix, they just dive in and they just played around it. So that's the process of active experimentation. And by experimenting, they develop concrete experience. Now, during that reflection, which is actually for me to collect the data, they actually reflected on, how was I listening? Because that was some of my questions. How was I listening? And then some of them realized that, oh yeah, I was listening in this way. This is what I was doing. They started reflecting and observing themselves. And then what happened was that they created abstract concepts in terms of, oh, this is how I can change now. So one of those things that some participants did was, even though I was giving them increasing autonomy, increasing power to show the indicators, there was 1 or 2 participants actually chose not to show the indicators because they felt that seeing the indicators was actually affecting the way they mixed. So they actually decided that, hey, I'm going to continue trying to not see the indicators. They adapted and they created their own pedagogy from there, which, in a way sort of made me irrelevant, right? But then that's where it came across me in the case of autonomy. So learner's autonomy, it's actually, when I was researching about learner autonomy, it has to do a lot of language learning skills itself. But I think that there's a lot of application in terms of any form of learning. And autonomy in the learning itself, relevant autonomy, is actually promoting the learner to take responsibility of their own learning. And I think that by creating all these practice sessions, they develop a sense of responsibility. That's why they say that, hey, I'm not going to see the indicators anymore because it's affecting me. I'm starting to make decisions based on that. They decided to take charge of their own learning through practice, which is actually very similar to what a musician would do when they're practicing their instrument. They choose what drills they want to practice. Oh, I need to work on this. I'm going to do that. So now I'm actually adapting it for, audio mixing. How can I practice and I reflect on it? So we're actually giving power to the learner. All right. And creating this kind of very autonomous learning kind of thing, okay, where it's very in line with the constructivist theories of where the learner can create their own knowledge. So I'm actually reducing the amount of knowledge that I transfer to them, but instead facilitating and creating an environment for them to create and learn knowledge and learn from themselves. All right, which is very similar to, what theories like Jean Piaget, Jerome Bruner actually says about, the learner can construct the knowledge on their own, okay, and creating all these experiences on their own. But one of the things that I actually disagree is Bruner actually says that, the teacher is actually a teaching aid. It's a training aid. And I think that because his point of view was that, the teacher is there to correct the mistakes. The teacher is there to, transfer knowledge in some form as well. And that's the part that I kind of disagree, in a sense that I think that in this case, the educator is someone who knows how to craft the learning environment. And the role of the modern educator, especially, in this case of, with the COVID-19 situation around, where we can't actually be in the definition of a classroom has changed. Again, we can't be there in the same space at all right? This whole process of creating learning environment and creating learning experiences is becoming increasingly relevant for the learner to actually conduct their own experiences and engage in their own form of practice and develop a sense of responsibility for their learning. So this is where I think that there might be some interesting things to go towards autonomous kind of learning aspects itself, but we're not really making the teacher irrelevant. And I don't really like that concept of the word teacher because it means that you have to transfer the knowledge, but the idea of the educator actually crafting all these kind of tools, crafting this kind of experiences and sort of allowing the learner to learn better on their own. So there are a couple of limitations here in that my sample size is pretty small. So it is by no means definitive that yes, this is works or this doesn't work. Cognitive science is a very difficult thing because we can't actually, we can probe the brain, that I didn't probe anybody's brain. Okay, so I don't know definitively that the science is correct. There are several methods that I can use, but I didn't actually employ it because due to the limited time itself. All right, now also due to the limited time, okay, I wasn't able to confirm the theory, which grounded theory actually asks us to do discriminate sampling, which means testing with a totally separate group to test whether the theory is sound. So I have not managed to do that yet, and that's something that I would be interested in doing in the future. I just couldn't do it because of the whole, kind of work from home and everybody kind of social distancing. So that's something that I'll be interested in my future research, and how can I sort of go beyond the audio mixing process of just the volume in the pan. So adapting this to other audio signal processing kind of thing. If those things work, then maybe there is something that could even be ported into the professional industry, because the idea of being able to see yet not see software, it's a pretty useful thing because you no longer need to close your eyes and mix anymore on a software kind of environment, which is pretty challenging. Yep, so that's it for my presentation. If you have any questions for me.